and he rewrote it for the 21st century as a high-tech duel. That was brilliant. That was brilliant. I'm sure he thought about this trolling before. He didn't come up with that at the spur of the moment. Obviously, he thought about it before. And the way he delivered in a deadpan manner was even better. It was perfect. Knowing, first of all, that this is never going to happen, number one. And number two, if it ever happened, the humiliation of all these NATO-stunned idiots would be larger than the actual current humiliation they are suffering in the black soil of Novorossiya. So he felt free to spell it out. And obviously, this proves that, first of all, the West will never understand what Oreshnik is all about. One of the good explanations about Oreshnik lately has been Dmitry Orlov's explanation, which is physics and mathematics, essentially. And obviously, all these guys who run policy from Washington to Brussels, they are less than zero in both physics and mathematics. So they will never understand the Oreshnik principle. Not to mention that the Russians are working on other systems similar to Oreshnik or even more hardcore than Oreshnik. So let's say this was a little bit of, I wouldn't say comic relief, but, considering some of the questions and the answers were so heavy, this was playful putting in action.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Pepe, because Russia did just conduct what they call a long-range precision strike on Kiev, and I'm curious, did they use the Oreshnik here or not?
Apparently not. No, apparently not. As far as we know so far, no. It was some sort of ICBM. We still don't know what. And, little problem. They could have hit this design center and the SBU command center, come on, over a year ago, 2 years ago. Why now? Why wait so long? And this is not me saying it. This is what you hear in Moscow, in many circles, especially circles close to the Siloviki, the intel agencies, the people who are in favor of going for the head of the snake for a long time, and they think that Putin is too moderate, and he is. But there is a serious backlash. And after the killing of General Kirillov, that continues. He had no protection, Danny. Can you imagine that he leaves his house in the morning? There's not even a guard in front of his apartment. It's absurd. It's totally absurd. Just as before they killed Daria Dugina, Dugin had no protection at all. He has protection now, but that's after the fact. It's ridiculous. Kirillov, which is one of the most important actors in the whole unmasking of everything that the Pentagon has been doing in terms of biolabs, not only in Ukraine, but everywhere. Nothing, absolutely nothing. So there are serious problems in Russia in terms of lax security procedures. And a lot of people who don't need protection, they actually enjoy it. So that's serious. And when you touch this subject in Moscow, this is very, very touchy. It depends on how you frame it, especially if you're a foreigner. You have to be very careful. But this backlash against so, too many velvet gloves dealing with everything coming from those literally neo-Nazis in Kiev, But it's complicated because it involves the Ministry of Defense, layers at the Ministry of Defense, different layers in the intel agencies, the discussions between Putin and the Security Council, what other people in the Security Council do to influence Putin's policies. It's very, very, very complex, So for outsiders to say blah, 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 it's basically blah, blah, blah. They don't know shit, in fact. And when we are there in Moscow and we see, for instance, inside ministries, the serious fiefdoms inside ministries, we see how complex the problem is. And when it comes to the Ministry of Defense, it's even more complicated because the Ministry of Defense is like a fortress. And it's impregnable for practically everyone, except insiders in the Ministry of Defense.
What do you believe Russia's response to this will be then? Because it appears that we've had reports from U.S. intel saying that Russia will use the Oreshnik again. And then we just had Igor Kirillov be assassinated on Russian soil in Moscow. What do you believe the response will be to this? Because it appears that as we go into January 20th, 2025, the changing administration in the United States, it seems like the United States and NATO are upping the ante in terms of escalating this conflict.
Well, NATO keep escalating. The only thing that NATO does is to escalate. We know that. And this window is very, very, we have this window of 1 month, roughly. This is probably the most dangerous months that, in recent history. Really, anything could happen. False flag. This thing could derail in a flash. We know it. First of all, because they're desperate. When I say they, is the exiting crash test dummy administration. And they only have 1 month to produce some facts on the ground that could alter, I would say, the flow of history, which shows an absolutely humiliating defeat, strategic defeat of NATO across the spectrum in Novorossiya. You cannot alter this fact, and this fact is practically inevitable. It's ahead of us, could be in the next few months, could be before the end of 2025 maximum, but it's inevitable. And there's nothing they can do to alter this fact apart from a direct intervention, which we all know what it means. And they're cowards, essentially. They won't do it. They're cowards. The only thing that they do is provocation. The strategy of the empire, and our friend Michael Hudson was one of the best interpreters, still is chaos, is anarchy. I used this in my last column before the one that I wrote today. And I quoted Michael. The American project essentially is anarchy. And now they installed total anarchy in West Asia. Nobody knows what will come out of having a crypto emir of Damascus controlled by Turkish intel and military intel sitting in thesis as the new emir of Syria. And all these repercussions are everywhere with all the players. So that's perfect in terms of an anarchic scenario. In Ukraine, the only thing that they can do, that the cornered empire can do, is provoke more chaos and more anarchy. But they are dealing directly with a nuclear superpower and hypersonic superpower. It's a completely different story. Syria was a practically non-government at the end. And the way the Syrian Arab army dissolved was, so many factors led to it. We cannot blame the soldiers of the Syrian Arab army. The country had been starved, literally, practically to death for almost 14 years. So it was a tsunami of sanctions, a state of siege, leading to starvation, almost mass starvation, an army that was not equipped, an army that said, okay, we did everything after that deal that they struck in 2020, and Salafi jihadis were more or less in that cage in greater Idlibistan. They said, this thing is over. No, of course not. And of course, the Iranians and the Russians do that. And when they start warning Assad, look, this thing is going to explode this past few months, so we went through it, since June by Ayatollah Khamenei, Russians, Iranians, everything, So it was inevitable that this was happening in Syria. In Ukraine, it's a completely different story. the Russians are controlling everything. The Russians control the battlefield. The Russians control up to where they're going to take the battlefield. The Russians control when we decide to end the story. And once again, Putin, during the Q&A, he was so diplomatic when he talked about the possible end of the war in Ukraine. He outlined the basic contours, but in a very soft way. He basically came back to Istanbul in 2022. Istanbul does not apply anymore because the conditions in the battlefield are completely different. You cannot go back to what they practically clinched in Istanbul at the time. No. And obviously when NATO is a side player. When the American generals and the Pentagon, they look at the state of the battlefield and what Russia could say, look, these are our conditions, they freak out completely. Because then it's total humiliating defeat and they cannot escape it. But Putin still said, okay, we come back to, what was agreed in Istanbul and all that. We need a legitimate government in Kiev, which they know it's not going to happen. Putin actually said, if Zelensky calls for elections and becomes a legitimate leader of Ukraine, we'll discuss with him. Putin knows that, first, Zelensky is not going to call elections. Second, he is already illegitimate. And third, he will lose the elections if he calls them. So, it's a vicious circle. Who they're going to discuss with about the future. And of course, Putin also said, we only sign deals if there is a legitimate leader in Ukraine. Once again, very important. It's not a legitimate leader in Ukraine that is going to decide anything and sign anything. Putin knows more than anybody that it's the American president. And coming back to Lavrov has been talking about this for months, over a year, in fact. The US is a non-agreement capable superpower. So basically, there are several ways to interpret why Putin was so accommodating when talking about a possible resolution for Ukraine. Okay, this was, let's say, an exercise in public relations, the Q&A. So he couldn't get too deep into it. So he left, once again, everything up in the air, right? And being very accommodating. But we know, by what he's been saying for the past few months, by what Medvedev has been saying, by what is filtered through Peskov and all that, that the Russian conditions are those conditions spelled out since June, and they're very, very strict. And they know that the Americans will never accept any of that. But that's it. That's it. And that's not going to change, Danny and all of you. So the question becomes, after January 20, what is Trump's margin of maneuver, and what margin of maneuver the deep state will give him to negotiate? It's not him. He cannot negotiate anything. He can negotiate maybe an MMA fight with a Dagestan wrestler in Madison Square Garden, but he cannot solve the war in Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin was very clear, saying that Russia is in the driver's seat, that the military is taking entire square kilometers with each passing day in Ukraine. So the question remains then, given all of this, how do you see Russia playing out the rest of this conflict moving into the Trump administration? Because right now, what it seems Vladimir Putin is saying is that it's all full steam ahead.
Yes.
And you have this dynamic, too, of Vladimir Putin talking, as you said, more moderately, Dmitry Medvedev talking more, maybe radically, we could say, in terms of responses to these red lines being crossed. Where do you see all of this falling? Somewhere in the middle, or are we going to see more of the same coming up?
I'll answer your question, Danny, next month. I'll be back in Russia by the end of January. And this is one of my key questions everywhere. Apart from the not exactly answered question about strategic defeat in Syria. Well, in 1 month, the situation, a month and a half, the situation in Syria is going to evolve very, very fast. But on Ukraine, we're going to have a pretty good idea of where things are going after a few days of the Trump administration in place. So, I would say late January until mid-February, we're going to have a pretty good idea where this is going. There will probably be a phone call, right? At least one phone call, direct phone call. Maybe they'll set up a meeting. So, so far, I would say for all of us, we have to be on red alert on what might go horribly wrong during the next 4 weeks.
Which could be? I mean, what could we be expecting in the next 4 weeks? Because I definitely understand the sentiment given what we have seen thus far, the increasing escalation, strikes on Russian territory, assassinations of major military figures in Russia. What could be next?
A provocation in Moscow, much bigger than killing General Kirillov. I would say that this is the #1 possibility because the SBU can do that with their NATO advisors. They can easily do it. And then all bets are off. Because you cannot say, we're going to respond, this is a red line. No. Then all bets are really off. So we have reason to be extremely worried, all of us. Mm-hmm. And these people are out of control, Danny, we know. And the exiting bunch before January 20, they are mega losers. They lost everything. They lost all their bets.